I never thought my life could unravel so completely in a single afternoon. For 21 years, Emily and I had built a life together, a marriage that felt solid, unbreakable. We raised our son, Nathan, who had just turned 19 and was in his second year of college. Life wasn't perfect, but it was ours, and I thought we had weathered the toughest storms. Then came the diagnosis. It began innocuously, just fatigue, a persistent ache in my side, and night sweats I wrote off as stress. Emily had been the one to push me. "You need to see a doctor, David," she insisted one morning, handing me my coffee. "You're not invincible, no matter how much you like to think you are." I brushed her off at first, but eventually relented. A week later, I sat in a cold, impersonal doctor's office as the words stage 2 cancer hit me like a freight train. It was treatable, the doctor assured me, but the road would be grueling. I tried to focus on the treatment plan, the percentages and statistics he rattled off, but my ears buzzed and my chest felt hollow. Emily sat beside me, clutching my hand like a vice, her knuckles white. "We'll get through this," she said, her voice trembling but resolute. Her confidence bolstered me in that moment. I felt like I could face anything with her by my side. The days following the diagnosis were a blur of tests, hospital visits, and quiet conversations with Nathan, who promised to come home every weekend to help out. Emily became my rock, managing appointments, medications, and meals with a precision that left me in awe. She didn't falter, didn't complain, but something in her changed. At first, I chalked it up to stress. She seemed distracted, often glued to her phone, her laughter more forced. When I asked, she shrugged it off. "It's just work," she'd say. "Mark's been piling more on me lately." Mark, her boss. I didn't think twice about it then. We'd been married for 21 years. What reason would I have not to trust her? But looking back, I realized that was the moment the cracks in our marriage began to show. The first few weeks after my diagnosis, Emily was the perfect partner, attentive, compassionate, tireless. But as my treatments began and the days blurred into an endless cycle of exhaustion and nausea, I started to notice her slipping away. It was little things at first. She was late coming home from work more often, her excuses vague and hurried. Mark had me stay late to finish a presentation, she'd say, avoiding my eyes. When I pressed for details, she'd sigh and wave it off. "It's nothing, David. Don't stress yourself with my work stuff." Her phone was another thing. It never used to leave her side before, but now she seemed almost guarded about it. The constant buzzing of texts and calls became a fixture in our evenings. Sometimes, she'd excuse herself to take a call in the other room, her voice low, her words muffled through the closed door. I wanted to believe her. For 21 years, we'd faced everything together. Raising Nathan through late-night feedings, school struggles, and teenage rebellion had only made us stronger. Why would I doubt her now? But doubt has a way of creeping in, no matter how hard you try to push it away. One night, I woke up in a cold sweat, my body aching from the chemo. Reaching out to Emily's side of the bed, I found it empty. Panic gripped me as I stumbled out of bed, only to find her sitting in the living room, her face illuminated by the glow of her phone. "Emily," I asked, my voice groggy. She jumped, clutching the phone tightly. "David, you scared me," she said, forcing a smile. I couldn't sleep. "Who are you talking to?" I asked, nodding at her phone. Her smile faltered for a moment before she recovered. "No one. Just scrolling through emails." She stood quickly, tucking the phone into her pocket. "You should be resting." Her words were caring, but her tone felt off. Emily's absences became harder to ignore. At first, it was late nights at work, excused with mentions of important projects and last-minute deadlines. Then came the weekends, when she claimed errands or visits to friends required her attention for hours at a time. I wanted to believe her. For weeks, I tried to convince myself that she was just coping with stress in her own way. After all, this diagnosis hadn't just shaken me. It had rocked our entire family. But the unease inside me grew louder with each passing day. Nathan noticed it too. When he came home for the weekend, he asked where his mother was. I gave him the same vague answer Emily always gave me, but his expression said he wasn't convinced. "She's been gone a lot lately," he said quietly, more to himself than to me. I said nothing, but his words stayed with me. That evening, Emily didn't return home until well past midnight. I heard her car pull into the driveway, her careful steps as she entered the house. She slipped into the bedroom without a word, moving quietly as if to avoid waking me. I lay there, wide awake, pretending to sleep. I could feel the tension radiating from her as she climbed into bed and turned her back to me. The scent of unfamiliar cologne lingered faintly in the air, a detail I might have dismissed before, but not now. Doubt had turned into something sharper, heavier. I didn't want to confront it, but the truth was becoming impossible to ignore. Emily's absences had become impossible to ignore. Late nights at work, long errands on weekends. Each excuse chipped away at the trust we had built over 21 years. I told myself it was the stress of my illness, the pressure of her job, or simply her way of coping. But deep down, I knew there was something more. One afternoon, while Emily was at work, her laptop sat on the dining room table, unattended. It wasn't unusual for us to share devices. Our lives had always been open books. But that day, the laptop felt different, like it held answers I wasn't ready to face. I opened it, my hands unsteady. At first, there was nothing out of the ordinary: work emails, reminders, to-do lists. Then I found a folder labeled personal. My pulse quickened as I clicked on it, revealing a string of emails between Emily and her boss, Mark Patterson. The first email stopped me cold. "Last night was exactly what I needed. You make me forget everything." My chest tightened as I scrolled through their exchanges. Each message painted a clearer picture of betrayal. They spoke of secret meetings, late-night rendezvous, and shared moments stolen from the life Emily and I had built. One email struck the deepest blow. "David is so focused on his treatments, he doesn't notice. I can't handle being around him all the time. It's too much." Her words gutted me. While I was fighting for my life, Emily had found comfort in the arms of Mark, a man I had trusted, a man who had been in our home. The betrayal wasn't just personal. It was calculated. I closed the laptop and sat in silence, the weight of the discovery pressing down on me. Emily had turned away from me at the time I needed her most, seeking solace in someone who had no place in our lives beyond the professional. When Nathan returned home later that day, he sensed something was wrong immediately. My silence and the hollow look in my eyes spoke louder than any words. For now, I couldn't bring myself to explain what I had uncovered, but I knew the truth wouldn't stay hidden for long. I spent the night in restless silence, the weight of Emily's betrayal gnawing at me. By morning, I hadn't slept, and the house felt unbearably empty despite Nathan's presence. He had noticed my mood, his concerned glances following me as I moved through the day like a ghost. By late afternoon, I knew I couldn't keep it from him any longer. Nathan deserved to know the truth, no matter how much it hurt to share it. When he walked into the living room, I handed him Emily's laptop, already open to the emails. I couldn't find the words, so I let him read for himself. His expression shifted with each passing second, from confusion to shock, then to a seething anger I had never seen in him before. He set the laptop down, his hands clenched into fists. "This can't be real." "It's real," I said, my voice hollow. "She's been cheating on you with Mark Patterson." His words were sharp, each syllable dripping with disbelief and fury. "Dad, that guy came to my graduation. He was in our house." I nodded, unable to meet his eyes. Nathan stood abruptly, pacing the room, his anger radiating like heat. "How long has this been going on? Does she even care what this is doing to us?" He stopped, his jaw tight. "This isn't just cheating. She betrayed all of us." I reached out to calm him, but he pulled away. "No, Duff, you're too forgiving. She doesn't deserve that. She doesn't deserve any of this." I saw something shift in him, a determination, a fire I hadn't expected. Nathan had always been protective, but this was different. This was personal. "I'm not going to let her get away with this," he said, his voice low and cold. "She doesn't get to wreck our family and walk away like nothing happened." "Nathan, don't," I started, but he was already heading toward the door, his mind set on confronting her. Watching him leave, I felt a mixture of dread and relief. dread for the storm he was about to unleash, and relief that, for the first time since this nightmare began, I wasn't alone in my anger. Nathan returned late that evening, his face flushed with anger and his hands trembling as he slammed the door behind him. I had been sitting in the living room, waiting, knowing there was no stopping him, but still fearing what might happen when he faced Emily. She didn't even deny it, he said, his voice raw. Not one excuse, not one apology, just stood there like I was inconveniencing her. I sat silently, letting him pace as his emotions spilled out. She said she deserves to feel alive, Nathan continued, his voice breaking. Like you've somehow taken something from her by being sick. Can you believe that? He turned to me, his eyes filled with rage and betrayal. How could she do this to you, to us? I had no answers. Emily's choices were a void I couldn't understand, and I didn't have the strength to dissect them. She thinks she can just move on, Nathan said, his voice rising. With him while you're here, fighting for your life? No. I'm not letting her get away with this. I stood, placing a hand on his shoulder, trying to steady him. Nathan, I know you're angry. So am I. But revenge won't fix this. It won't make it better. He shrugged me off, shaking his head. You might be able to forgive her, Dad, but I won't. Not for this. She ruined everything. She doesn't deserve a second of peace after what she's done. I watched him storm down the hallway to his room, slamming the door shut behind him. The sound echoed through the house, leaving a suffocating silence in its wake. Nathan's fury was justified, but it terrified me. He was my son, my family, but the fire in his eyes reminded me too much of the path Emily had taken, one led by emotions, not reason. As much as I wanted to confront Emily myself, I knew that dragging this out would only make the wounds deeper. Something had to change, and it had to happen soon. The morning light filtered through the blinds as I sat in the stillness of the living room. The air felt heavy, thick with the knowledge that nothing in our lives would ever be the same again. The betrayal hung over me like a storm cloud, but beneath the pain, something new was growing, a quiet determination. Nathan hadn't come out of his room since his confrontation with Emily. I could hear the faint sound of his footsteps pacing the floor above, restless and angry. He wasn't ready to let this go, but neither was I. The difference was, I had decided I wouldn't let my anger consume me. Emily returned that evening, walking into the house with the same practiced indifference she'd worn for weeks. Her footsteps echoed in the silence as she set her purse on the counter. She glanced my way briefly, her expression unreadable, before heading toward the kitchen. I spoke her name, the sound of it halting her in her tracks. Without looking at her, I gestured toward the dining table. We need to talk, I said simply. She hesitated but didn't argue, sitting across from me with an air of annoyance, as though this was just another inconvenience in her busy day. I know about Mark, I said, my voice steady, void of emotion. Her reaction was subtle, a flicker of something in her eyes, quickly masked by a sigh as she leaned back in her chair. I figured you'd find out eventually, she said, her tone flat. There was the confirmation of everything I had dreaded. But what struck me most wasn't the betrayal itself. It was the complete absence of regret in her voice. I pressed her for nothing, asked no questions. I didn't need the details. The evidence had already said more than enough. The room seemed to shrink as the tension between us grew. Emily's words spilled out, not in apology, but in justification. She spoke of feeling trapped, of wanting an escape, of how her time with Mark had reminded her of something she claimed she'd lost. I listened in silence, my hands gripping the edge of the table to steady myself. Her excuses were daggers, each one twisting deeper. When she finally finished, she looked at me, waiting for my response. You made your choice, I said after a long pause, my voice cold and measured. Now I'm making mine. You need to leave. Her eyes widened, disbelief flickering across her face. For the first time, her composure cracked. David, you can't be serious. But I didn't falter. I stood, towering over her as I spoke the words I'd been holding back since the moment I found out. You don't belong here anymore. This house is no longer your refuge. She argued, of course. But her words, her tears, if they were even genuine, held no power over me anymore. I had spent weeks drowning in the weight of her betrayal, but now I was clawing my way back to the surface. As she packed her belongings, the house was eerily silent. Nathan didn't come downstairs. He didn't need to see this part. I wouldn't let him. This was my battle to end. When the front door finally closed behind her, a strange calm settled over me. The betrayal still burned, but the house felt lighter without her presence. For the first time in weeks, I breathed deeply, the air no longer stifling. The house felt suffocating in the silence that followed Emily's departure. Her absence left a void, but the betrayal hung in the air like a shadow, refusing to let me forget. Upstairs, Nathan's pacing grew louder, each step filled with restless energy that echoed through the walls. The slam of his door announced his descent before I even saw him. He stormed down the stairs, his movements sharp and filled with purpose. Without a word, he grabbed his coat from the rack, his jaw set in a way that made it clear he wasn't seeking permission. "Nathan," I called, but he didn't stop. The door slammed behind him before I could say more. The minutes dragged on, my mind racing with worry. Nathan's anger wasn't the quiet kind. It was volcanic, capable of destruction if left unchecked. I knew where he had gone, but I also knew there was no stopping him now. When he returned an hour later, his face was flushed from the cold, his fists clenched tightly at his sides. He dropped his coat on the floor and stood in the middle of the room, his shoulders heaving with each breath. He didn't look at me, but I could feel the fury radiating from him. The tension in his body was palpable, as if he was barely holding himself together. His hands shook, not from the cold, but from the force of his emotions. Nathan sat heavily on the couch, burying his face in his hands. His breathing was ragged, his body trembling with the weight of his anger. I didn't ask what had happened. I didn't need to. The tension in the room told me everything. For a long time, neither of us spoke. He stayed there, silent and seething, while I watched, feeling powerless to help. His rage was a storm, and I knew it wouldn't pass easily. Eventually, he stood and disappeared back upstairs, his steps heavy and deliberate. The slam of his bedroom door was the only sound that followed. I stayed where I was, staring at the empty space he had left behind. Nathan's anger burned hotter than mine ever could, and I feared where it might lead him. For now, all I could do was sit in the quiet and hope that he would find a way to channel it before it consumed him. The days after Emily's departure were a blur of quiet tension and unresolved anger. The house felt colder, emptier, though the absence of her presence was a relief in some ways. I threw myself into routines, medication schedules, small walks around the yard, and moments of stillness where I tried to remind myself that life could still move forward. Nathan, however, wasn't finding the same peace. His fury simmered just beneath the surface, spilling out in subtle ways, slamming doors, sharp tones, and long silences that felt more loaded than words ever could. He barely spoke to me, his anger at Emily bleeding into frustration at the world, at her situation, at me for not being angry enough. I didn't push him. His rage was a shield, and I knew it was the only thing keeping his pain at bay. One evening, I found him sitting in the living room, staring blankly at the TV. The screen was off, his reflection staring back at him in the dark glass. He had been like this for hours, lost in his thoughts. His fists were clenched tightly, his body tense as if bracing for a fight. I sat beside him, not saying a word. The silence stretched between us, heavy but not unbearable. Slowly, his hands relaxed, his shoulders dropping slightly. The next morning, I decided it was time to reclaim control over my life. I began setting small goals for myself, walking farther each day, cooking meals instead of relying on takeout, even sorting through old papers that had piled up. The simple act of doing something, anything, felt like a rebellion against the despair that had threatened to consume me. Nathan watched me, his expression unreadable. He didn't comment on my efforts, but I noticed the way he lingered in the kitchen longer than usual, his presence a quiet acknowledgement that he was paying attention. It wasn't much, but it was a start. Nathan's anger didn't fade after Emily left. It hardened into something sharper, colder. While I focused on recovering and trying to rebuild what was left of our lives, Nathan channeled his fury into a single purpose, making Emily pay for what she had done. He didn't speak much about it to me, but I could see the determination in his eyes. Quietly, methodically, he began his campaign to ruin her life. Nathan started by targeting Emily's reputation at work. He knew she valued her career and that her professional standing was a cornerstone of her identity. Using information he'd found in the emails I had shown him, Nathan compiled evidence of her affair with Mark Patterson. He sent an anonymous email to the board of directors at her company, detailing her relationship with Mark. The email included screenshots of their messages, which painted a clear picture of their inappropriate conduct. The company, known for its strict ethical policies, acted swiftly. Mark Patterson was terminated almost immediately, his reputation in shambles. Emily wasn't fired, but the whispers started. Colleagues avoided her in meetings, and clients began questioning her professionalism. Her career, once thriving, was now teetering on the edge. Next, Nathan turned to her personal life. Emily had always prided herself on her social circle, friends, neighbors, and acquaintances who admired her. Nathan knew this was her weak spot. Using anonymous social media accounts, he began leaking details of her affair, crafting posts that hinted at her betrayal and her abandonment of her family. He didn't name her outright, but left enough clues that those in her circle quickly connected the dots. The fallout was immediate. Friends stopped returning her calls. Invitations to events dried up. Neighbors who once waved to her in passing now turned away, their smiles replaced with cold indifference. The final blow came when Nathan discovered Emily had been quietly funneling money into a separate savings account before she left. She had been preparing for her departure, planning to secure herself financially while leaving us behind. Nathan accessed the account using passwords she had carelessly reused over the years. He locked her out completely, transferring the funds back to our joint account, the one she had abandoned when she left. Legally, there was little she could do. The money had been accumulated during the marriage, and I had every right to claim it. Nathan's actions left her with almost nothing, forcing her to scramble to cover her expenses. Emily's life crumbled in slow motion. Her career was in tatters, her social circle had vanished, and her financial safety net was gone. She became an outcast, isolated and desperate. One evening, Nathan returned from a walk, his face calm, but his eyes distant. He didn't say much, but I knew he had heard from her. Later, I saw her name appear on his blocked contacts list. Whatever words had passed between them, they were the final ones. For Nathan, this wasn't about revenge. It was about justice. He had watched her destroy our family, and he needed her to understand the pain she had caused. "She took everything from us, Dad," he said quietly one day. "I just made sure she felt the same. I didn't condone what he had done, but I didn't argue with him either." Emily had made her choices, and now she was living with the consequences. In the weeks after Nathan's actions came to light, the storm began to settle. Emily was gone from our lives, her absence no longer a wound, but a distant memory. The house, once filled with tension and anger, began to feel like a place of quiet resilience. Nathan still carried the weight of what he had done, though he rarely spoke about it. I could see it in his quieter moments, the way his jaw tightened or his gaze lingered on nothing in particular. He had achieved what he set out to do, but justice came with its own kind of burden. I focused on my recovery. Each day brought small victories, less fatigue, longer walks, moments where I could almost forget the shadow of my illness. Nathan joined me often, his presence a silent but steady source of support. One afternoon, as we walked through the park near our home, Nathan finally broke his silence. "I don't regret it," he said, his voice low but firm. "What I did to her, she deserved it." I didn't respond immediately, letting the weight of his words hang between us. "But it didn't fix anything," he added after a pause. His shoulders sagged, his steps slowing. "It didn't take away what she did to us. It didn't make it hurt any less." I placed a hand on his shoulder, squeezing gently. "It won't," I said quietly. "Nothing will. But what you did gave us something." She tried to take a sense of control. Nathan nodded, his expression somber. For the first time, the fire in his eyes seemed to dim, replaced by something quieter, acceptance. The days turned into weeks, and life began to take on a new rhythm. Nathan threw himself into his studies, using his determination to build a future for himself. I could see him healing, bit by bit, as he found purpose beyond the anger that had once consumed him. For me, recovery was a longer journey, but I embraced each step forward. The house felt lighter without Emily's presence, her shadow no longer looming over our lives. One evening, Nathan came home with a book tucked under his arm, a journal he had started to fill with thoughts, plans, and hopes for the future. He handed it to me, his face hesitant but hopeful. "I think I'm ready to move on," he said simply. I opened the journal, flipping through the pages filled with his neat handwriting and sketches of dreams yet to be realized. It was a testament to his resilience, a sign that he had finally begun to let go. Together, we sat in the quiet of the living room, the air between us filled with unspoken understanding. The betrayal that had shattered our family no longer defined us. We had found a way to rebuild stronger than before. As I looked at Nathan, I saw not just my son, but a man who had faced unimaginable pain and come out the other side. In his strength, I found my own, and in that moment I knew we would be okay.